A long time ago, the rulers of the lands had the tallest castes. Nothing has changed in 1,000 years. The Federal Reserve is a private, for-profit corporation, just like McDonald's and Starbucks. They call themselves the Federal Reserve to trick people into thinking it's part of the US federal government. But it isn't. It's an independent corporation just like Del Monte or Exxon. Just like the local barber shop or supermarket in your neighborhood. The main function of the Federal Reserve is to loan money to the US government. When the US government needs a $10 billion loan, the Federal Reserve is the one that loans it to them. The government then has to pay back the loan in a specified amount of time with interest. Here's the scam. Let's say the US government wants to borrow $10 billion and agrees to pay it back with interest in 10 years. The Federal Reserve would then pay a few $1,000s for some paper and ink and print $10 billion. This $10 billion would be given to the US government and they would distribute it to federal banks. The federal banks would distribute the money to smaller banks. From there, the money would be distributed to people in the form of bank loans. Money is plentiful and the society prospers. After 10 years, the loan is due. Even if the federal government was able to take back every single dollar from every single person and get back the entire $10 billion to pay back the loan, how are they going to pay back the interest? The answer is they can't. They have to borrow more money just to pay back the interest. This is why the US national debt is $20 trillion. The only president to ever pay off the national debt was Andrew Jackson. He prevented the formation of a central bank and he not only paid off the debt of the US while he was president, he also paid off the national debts of all the other presidents before him since they were all prisoners of this bank-run scam. Andrew Jackson was a US president and war hero. He survived an assassination attempt. He could have had anything written on his tombstone. Instead, they inscribed this.
So what is the national debt? When government spends more than it collects in taxes, it has to borrow the difference by selling interest-bearing IOUs, such as U.S. bonds. When a U.S. bank buys a $100 U.S. bond, it gets to loan out 10 times that amount. So the bank not only gets back the $100 plus interest from the federal government, it gets to loan out another $1,000 it doesn't have and charge additional interest. Banks are allowed to create this extra money out of thin air. So, banks aren't making only 6% interest, for example. They are really making over 1,000% interest. That's why bank buildings are the biggest in every town on the planet.
The cause of inflation isn't some imaginary, hard-to-understand, distant economic concept, as the mainstream corporate controls mass media and educational system would have you believe. Banks loaning out more money than they actually have. This is the true cause of inflation. This is why your money is worth less and less every year. Simple as that. Who decides rich and poor? The wealth of a nation is determined by GDP, gross domestic product. The GDP of the country is determined by three factors: production, income and expenditures. When these three things go up, the GDP score of the country goes up. GDP is what determines which nations are quote-unquote developed nations or third world nations. Let's say there is some remote tropical island in the Pacific where a corporation decides to set up a fishing fleet to catch and package fish to sell on the open market. The GDP of the country will go up. Production, income and expenditures. New jobs will be created and the island's economy prospers. But what about the thousands of people who, for hundreds of years, fished freely off the coast? They face starvation and financial ruin, because the waters now belong to the corporation. Now the wealth of the land can be funneled to a few people at the top, aka free market capitalism.